I will not stand for anything that's crooked or unfair. I'm strictly on the up and up, so everyone beware. If anyone's caught taking graft and I don't get my share, we stand them up against the wall and out goes the weasel.
Help is here.
Here we are.
Oh, there we are. Here we are. Great.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Adam Gopnik.
Good evening, Mr. Noah Diamond.
Boy, those guys are good, aren't they?
They really are funny, aren't they? And sort of and brilliant. Noah, we want to talk a bit about this amazing movie on many levels. But let's start with the most basic level, if you would, draw on your Marxist expertise. How did this movie come to be made? It's famous as the last of their Paramount films, and it's famous as the most audacious of all their films. I remember Pauline Kael at The New Yorker once called it the Marx Brothers' greatest film, a semi-surrealist farce about war. How did the Marxists at Paramount come to make this astonishing movie?
Well, everything you say is true. It is the fifth and final of the Paramount films. The Marx Brothers made 5 films for Paramount, the first 2 of which were based on their Broadway successes, The Coconuts and Animal Crackers.
And both shot here in New York.
And both shot in Astoria, Queens,
right.
Yes.
Right.
And then they made 3 original films, this trilogy of great original comedies, Monkey Business, Horse Feathers, and this one, Duck Soup. Duck Soup comes about as a combination. There's basically 3 fountains of material feeding into this movie. Burt Kalmar and Harry Ruby, 2 of the greatest Marx Brothers writers of all time, they wrote songs for the brothers in Animal Crackers and in this, as well as Horse Feathers.
And were themselves, their lives were themselves subjects of one of the worst movies ever made.
Yes,
Little
Three
words.
Little Words.
3 little.
Yeah.
Right.
Fred Astaire and
Red Skelton.
Red Skelton, yeah.
Red Skelton, right.
There is a scene in that film where they write "Hooray for Captain Spaulding," and I'm sure that's how it really happened.
Kalmar and Ruby.
Burt Kalmar and Harry Ruby, yeah. And so they wrote a screenplay for the Marx Brothers, which was a war satire, originally called Cracked Ice.
Right.
And about a third of what's in the movie Duck Soup is from that work.
And I had the great privilege of having Noah over to our house one Christmas Eve, and we did a reading of Cracked Ice with Noah playing Groucho, and it was fascinating to see how close and yet how far it was from the finished Duck Soup.
Yeah, it's sort of Duck Soup before Duck Soup, and
Right.
one of the things that's interesting about it is it's a little harsher.
Yes.
The political satire in it is sharper and more
darker.
severe, darker.
Right.
Yeah, in that version, Rufus T. Firefly is the president of an ammunition company
Right.
who wants to start a war in order to be a war profiteer, essentially.
Yeah.
The brothers had also just finished a radio program called Flywheel, Shyster, and Flywheel, which was largely written by Arthur Sheikman and Nat Perrin, 2 more great Marx Brothers writers. And a lot of that material wound up in Duck Soup. And then this is really the only time that the Marx Brothers worked with a great comedy director, or someone with the reputation of a great comedy director, Leo McCarey. And a lot of what's in Duck Soup that is different from the rest of the Marx Brothers catalog is because of McCarey. McCarey was an old Hal Roach director who had actually been responsible for teaming Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy.
Right. And brought them together and directed, would go on then to have an extraordinary career because he directed the Going My Way and The Bells of St. Mary's, the 2 best Roman Catholic comedies of
Yes, indeed.
Of that
Where's
period.
that festival?
There's a wonderful interview with McCarey after he'd had a stroke, actually, and was limited in speech, but very precise in one of Peter Bogdanovich's books. What did McCarey particularly do the Marxists know brought to this movie? Because Groucho said at one point, if I remember correctly, Norman MacLeod, who directed Horse Feathers and Monkey Business, was a good director. Leo McCarey, he said, was a great director.
That's very true. And there is an argument, and I think a legitimate one, that in some ways a good director was better suited to the Marx Brothers than a great director. Norman MacLeod, yeah, he was a competent craftsman, but he was very good at filling a movie with someone else's personalities. Duck Soup has a lot of Leo McCarey's personality in it, and it succeeds wildly despite that. But its reputation is as this unadulterated Marx Brothers comedy because it doesn't spend a lot of time on a romantic subplot. There was supposed to be a love story between Zeppo and Raquel Torres, but poor Zeppo. And also, it doesn't even have the harp and piano solos.
Yes, right.
In every other Marx Brothers movie except Room Service, Chico plays the piano, and Harpo's harpistry is sort of referenced.
Yes, and he has a brief moment of pseudo playing the harp on the piano. Right.
Yeah. But you see the most of McCarey in the stuff that feels the most like a Hal Roach, Laurel and Hardy comedy. That would be the lemonade
Buchanan,
stand
right.
stuff, yeah, with Edgar Kennedy, who
Edgar
was
Kennedy, right.
An old Hal Roach player.
Famous for his slow take, his slow burn. Slow burn. And so that's McCarey's stuff. In retrospect, watching it again for the 100th time, what's astonishing is how beautifully art directed it is. It's of all the Marx's movies, it's by far the most visually splendid, and everything from the war room sets to the courtroom set to the incredible plasticity of Groucho's countless costumes in the war scene. The production values in Duck Soup seem higher even than in the other Paramount films, and even in a way higher than in the MGM films to come.
Yeah.
Who was responsible for that? Was it a bigger budget than they had before?
Yeah, by this time the Marx Brothers had really arrived. Also, Talking Films had arrived. You know, it took 2 films to even work out the technical complications of sound. Synchronized sound. Monkey Business and Horse Feathers were both phenomenal hits, as Coconuts and Animal Crackers had been, and this was a chance to spend more money on the Marx Brothers. Yeah, it's lavish looking in a way that Horse Feathers and Monkey Business certainly are not. Herman Mankiewicz was the iconoclastic producer of this film. It seems unlikely to credit him for the visual splendor, so I'll credit McCarey.
For doing it. The other thing, and this, given those kind of ABCs of the foundation of how the film got made, the other thing that's, there are many things amazing about the film, but the thing that is perhaps most significant is that it entered into the canon of great American movies, not just as a superior Marx Brothers comedy, but as a kind of prescient surrealist comedy, an absurdist farce, as it sometimes has been called. And that, watching it again tonight, I was struck by how powerful that is all over again. It's the sheer illogic of the situation. Absurdism is a movement in modern art and in modern culture. And this is a perfect example of it. The other thing that struck me particularly watching it again tonight, Noah, is that while it's frighteningly prescient of the war that is to come, that is the Second World War, in the madness that it evokes, it's clearly, if it has satirical energy, it's about the war that was less than 20 years old, the Great War, because it's set up to be a mockery of the Great War. It's these little Balkan countries that plummet themselves and everyone into war through a series of almost incomprehensible slights and differences, and that bring about this, in the Marxist term, comic catastrophe. But one of the other things that I think is genuinely powerful, and my friend Travis D has a lovely section about this in his new book, Marx Brothers Miscellany, where he talks about the genuine respect that the Marxists got from the European avant-garde, from everyone from Artaud to Jean Vigo, the great French surrealist filmmaker, isn't accidental. It isn't just a kind of pretentious highbrow compliment. They recognized exactly what the mainspring, it seems to me, of so much of the avant-garde of Europe after the First World War, the Dadaists and the surrealists, lay in their utter exhaustion and their absolute indignation at the madness of the pomposity and the officialdom that had led Europe into this unimaginable catastrophe of the Great War. And again in post-World War I art, You think of something like The Green Table, famous satiric ballet. You think above all of the work of the Dadaists, of Hannah Hawk and John Hartfield and Max Ernst and so on. They weren't just mocking the specifics of the politics that might lead to war. They were completely contemptuous and completely at their end of their patience with all of the regalia, the officialdom, the hierarchy that had produced such a catastrophic result. And that's very sharply satiric still in Duck Soup.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I think one of the real strengths of the Marx Brothers is that they're always working on multiple levels at the same time. Right. And that expresses itself a lot in this highbrow, lowbrow divide. Yeah. I mean, all of that is true. And you can come away from Duck Soup feeling like you've seen a satire, a political satire of the folly of war. It's also kind of a satire of war movies, maybe yes. more than of war itself. And then at the same time, you have, lighting Edgar Kennedy's hat on fire. Or the upstart business. The upstart business, that's like such a classic format, a template for a joke. Right. Groucho works himself into a state of ire over the possible bad reaction Trentino might have to him, so that by the time he sees Trentino, it's like, so you refuse to shake hands with me. Mm-hmm. And, that's our Archduke Ferdinand assassination of the Fredonia Sylvania War.
Exactly. In talking about Leo McCarey, we slid past on our way to the highbrow stuff what is perhaps the most legendary, the most famous sequence in the film, which is the mirror scene. Now, as I understand it, is it correct, Noah, that was a bit, a shtick that came from elsewhere and was, so to speak, parachuted into the movie?
Yeah, also a classic piece of comedy, silent comedy. Before the Marx Brothers, Max Linder used it in 7 Years Bad Luck. Chaplin did something like it in The Floor Walker. But it's so well appropriated by the Marx Brothers. It's certainly Leo McCarey's idea. I think McCarey unquestionably came up with the idea. And as Matthew Coniam has speculated in his book, The Annotated Marx Brothers, McCarey is probably telling them what to do off camera. That's why there's no soundtrack.
Say now spin now.
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
Right.
But in the hands of the Marx Brothers, this mirror gag that's so classic seems to become a sort of attack on individual identity.
Yeah.
And it also shows us that for the first time in the work of the Marx Brothers, we're sort of acknowledging that Groucho's look has become iconic.
Yes.
Harpo and Chico both disguise themselves as Groucho. They are also revealing that this character, Rufus T. Firefly, keeps black grease paint around.
Yes.
With which he seemingly applies his mustache and eyebrows every morning.
Yes.
And then later when he gets the vase on his head and Harpo paints Groucho's face on the vase.
Well, it's the classic thing. We were talking about it yesterday about the Marx Brothers as sort of the last and greatest instance of what the Greeks called old comedy. And one of the principles of that is that the comedian has an unchanging mask, as Groucho does, as Chaplin did in another way. But it's also beautiful for those of us who love the Marxists because it opens in a very peculiar and sort of almost Freudian way into the fraternity of the Marxists. Once Harpo and Chico put on that makeup, they are indistinguishable from Groucho. It's eerie, actually, how much the brotherliness of the three of them clinches the scene. It isn't a close fit. They are brothers, and they look so much like each other. And it makes me at least start thinking, Noah, about the degree to which the parts that they ended up playing were, if not arbitrary, then in some sense sort of segmented. Groucho became Groucho. Chico became Chico. Harpo became the mute one. And obviously that was their peculiar gifts. Groucho's a great verbal comedian by nature, and Harpo a great mime. But fraternity, the fraternity of the Marxes, is in so many ways, it seems to me, the underlying theme of so much Marx Brothers comedy. Because though they fight and bicker and mock and insult and slug each other, they always end up together. And it's I think it's our internal, our unspoken, almost subconscious sense of their fraternity, which creates the undercurrent of happiness, which underlies the absurdity.
Yeah, absolutely true. My friend Kathy Beal, who is here tonight, and my colleague on the Marxfest committee, has often made this beautiful point about them, that while their actions often seem unmotivated, actually they have a motivation that's always at work, and that is joy. Their motivation is joy. They do what they do for the sheer pleasure and fun of it. In Duck Soup, I think the most vivid example of that is Harpo and Chico trying to get into the Teasdale mansion.
Yes.
You know, ringing the doorbell and hiding behind the hedge. I mean, that too is very Laurel and Hardy in a way. It's very Hal Roach, Leo McCarey stuff. But with with Laurel and Hardy, they would be earnestly trying to enter the building.
Laurel and Hardy would have an internal logic. They'd be trying to get into the building, and the beautiful absurdist farce of their getting in and then coming back out would not take place at all. That overcharge of sheer joyful energy would not be part of the comedy.
Yeah, because with Laurel and Hardy, the joke is that they're incompetent.
Yes, right.
They would like to do a good job if they could. The Marx Brothers are hyper competent. They're superheroes.
Right.
They could have moved that piano up the stairs, you know, in the music box.
Yes, exactly.
But that wouldn't be fun. They would destroy the piano for fun.
Right, exactly. While Chico is playing a rumba on it at the same time.
And to the theme of friendship that Mike mentioned earlier, you know, that fraternal connection and the sort of collective impact of these four guys who are notably different and notably the same.
Right. And there's something so beautiful about the four of them sharing that one number, which we never get to see again, right? The four of them in that. If I remember correctly, that in one of Woody Allen's movies, he uses that scene, right, as an affirmation of everything that life has to offer, right? He wanders into a movie theater, and not only are his spirits lifted, but his faith in humanity is affirmed by seeing exactly that scene with the four Marxists together in Duck Soup.
Absolutely right. Yeah, I think that's Hannah and her sisters.
Hannah and her sisters, yeah.
He decides not to commit suicide after seeing the Marx Brothers.
Exactly, and that's the if you like, it's simultaneously the undercharge of joy that illuminates their movies and the overcharge of it that takes place in it. You know, that's another sense in which it seems to me when we talk about the Marx's connection to high art, serious art, surrealism, the absurdist movement, and so on. We're not just searching for implausible parallels, but really putting our finger on something very profound. Because, you know, if there's one thing, and it's something I've written about a lot, if there's one thing that imprints that kind of Dada, absurdist, surrealist sensibility, it's exactly the idea that only the conventional forms, the traditional forms of comedy are adequate to deal with the madness of modernity. That's a very deep idea, right? So you find it in Dada collage, for instance. You know, people had been making comic collages right throughout the 19th century. Just no one had ever seen in that throwaway comic form the means towards serious expression. And again, farce, comedy, slapstick. Samuel Beckett takes vaudeville slapstick and turns it into the means of existential despair. And that idea that the forms conventionally segregated to comedy had within them the possibility of the highest kind of expression is a central modernist idea, and the Marx Brothers don't just resemble it, they fulfill that program completely.
Yes, and comedy and drama have usually the same subject matter. Yeah. You know, it's execution that distinguishes them from each other. And I'm sure you know Mel Brooks's rubber ball analogy, that comedy is a rubber ball, and if you bounce it against a soft target, it won't bounce back. But if you bounce it against a hard brick wall, meaning a serious subject like war, then it'll bounce back and it'll be very lively. And most of the great comedies are about tragedy, you know, they're about certainly serious things and sometimes even terrible things like war.
Mel Brooks revived that great Jack Benny comedy, To Be or Not to Be, which is probably the farthest extension of that sensibility, a comedy about Jews in Poland trying to carry on in the theater in the midst of the occupation. I know we want to try and take some questions, Noah, but before we do, tell us a little bit, if you would. I've taken us far afield into the realms of structuralist criticism, but bring us back to the world of the box office and finances. This was, as you were saying, the last movie that the Marxes made for Paramount. By reputation, it was the last movie because it was a terrible failure. Is that true? And if it's not true, why did their relationship end with Paramount then?
Yeah, first of all, it's not true that Duck Soup was a flop. That is often the way the story is told. And it does make a good story because, their big success with A Night at the Opera and the change of format that Irving Thalberg championed at MGM is right ahead. So if you can tell the story where things are at their darkest at the end of the Paramount years, it makes the MGM years...
Which was a very Thalberg idea.
Yeah.
In every MGM Marx Brothers comedy, there's a low point.
That's right.
That gets lower and lower as the movies go on. But it's
with a Thalbergian storytelling flair,
Yeah.
people often want it to be that way. No, Duck Soup was not a failure. It was a very successful film. However, as is obvious from watching it, it was a much more expensive movie to make than Horse Feathers or Monkey Business. So its profits were not nearly as considerable, but its box office intake was comparable to the films which preceded it.
right.
They were in the middle of a contract dispute with Paramount. That's the real reason they wound up at MGM. They were in a salary dispute with Paramount. They almost walked off of Duck Soup and refused to make the movie. And Leo McCarey, who didn't really like the Marx Brothers much, he liked Harpo. But, when an interviewer in later years asked McCarey about Duck Soup, "What are your thoughts about Duck Soup?" he said, "Oh, I don't like that one very much." But I think it's generally thought that McCarey agreed to do the movie only because he thought it wouldn't happen, because the brothers were in such a dispute with the studio at the time.
So they weren't. The movie didn't fail, but their relationship with Paramount was bollocksed, and they went from there to MGM and A Night at the Opera 2 years later.
2 years, yeah.
2 years later, right.
Yeah, and Thalberg's idea was, your movies are funny, but they're sort of too funny. We can make movies that are half as funny, but twice as successful.
And he succeeded.
And he succeeded, yeah, exactly right. Yeah, and I wonder, may I ask you a question before we move on to audience questions? I just wonder personally, when did you first encounter Duck Soup? Where did it come in your Marx Brothers education? Yeah.
I remember very precisely, as I was saying yesterday, talking about Perlman and Horse Feathers. I grew up in Canada, in Montreal, as you know, and there was a station on the border, Channel 5 in Plattsburgh, New York, and they would show Marx Brothers movies now and then. And by then I had seen Horse Feathers and Monkey Business. Room Service, weirdly enough, because there was a random element about what got shown and what didn't. Not yet Animal Crackers. And then Duck Soup came on. And Duck Soup already, this is probably 1972, 1973, Duck Soup already had an aura around it. As I mentioned, Pauline Kael, if you read the New Yorker's goings-on about town and you saw what was playing at the Thalia, it would often be Duck Soup, which is why Woody Allen walks into it in Hannah and Her Sisters. And as I said before, Pauline Kael described it as the Marx Brothers' greatest film, a semi-surrealist farce about war, words to that effect. So I had enormously high expectations. I expected it to be greater, darker, and sharper than any of the Marx Brothers films. I recall being, to be honest with you, Noah, disappointed by all the lemonade stand knockabout comedy. It didn't seem to conform to the notion, but you go past it quickly. And I remember being then blown away by the last 15 minutes, which are hard to resist, by the genuinely hallucinatory quality of it. Groucho constantly changing his costume, the endless play back and forth, and it's the one thing that I think survives intact from Cracked Ice, from the first version which we read, is that it then turns and becomes a clearly anti-war movie. There's no more audacious anti-war sentiment than that when Mrs. Teasdale starts singing "Hail, Hail, Fredonia" at the end, and the Marxists turn on her. They have come to their end with patriotism, and it couldn't be more apparent that that's the target and subject of the movie. Perhaps I should say, because there's much good to be said about patriotism, nationalism. The sheer insanity of being a nationalist on behalf of Fredonia against Sylvania is unmistakable by the end of the film. And I remember being struck by that at midnight on a Saturday night in 1972, and even more so tonight.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
We would love to take a question or two. And I think Mike here Mike will deliver the mic.
Well, maybe not. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, now it can hear me. Have you ever written like an extensive essay in any venue on the Marx Brothers? I know you have.
Oh, me?
Yeah, yes, sir.
Yes, I did an essay about Groucho, a long essay about Groucho, actually, when Stefan Kampfer's biography of Groucho came out, which I think was in the early 2000s. Is that right? Yeah, and I did that, and I tried to organize all of my adoring thoughts about what makes Groucho such a superior comedian. If you remember, James Agee said that in Groucho, we had lost because there wasn't enough work, the greatest American satirist of the 20th century, and I tried to talk about that. So it must be about 2003, 2004, whenever the Kampfer book came out. In the New Yorker, yes, I work on the New Yorker plantation. I have to turn all my goods into the store, so I never can publish elsewhere.
It is also true, Adam, that the Marx Brothers come up incidentally in your writing with some frequency, often as a reference or a yardstick for comedic greatness.
They come up, I think, in almost everything I write, because there's always a line and there's always a moment, and also because they represent such a ever-inspiring instance of how something can be wildly, audaciously funny and still quite profound. So they're as you say, yes, absolutely, a constant reference. Makes my good wife sigh with despair as a non-Marxist, because I always bring the Marxists into everything.
I had picked up, as a fan of Adam's writing, for a near lifelong fan of Adam's writing, I had picked up on the fact, like, oh, he's a Marx Brothers fan. And when I was working on the revival of I'll Say She Is, which I adapted and played Groucho in the first revival, Adam was one of the people I wrote to just because I just wanted him to know about the project, and I thought he would be interested. And you wrote back, our first communication, this is on the theme of friendship, was you said, "As you suspected, I am indeed a Marx nut."
Yes, and got to come downtown to that extraordinary production of I'll Say She Is, and I got to write about it for the New Yorker. And like all of you, I'm sure, I'm just eager to see it again and to see it fully launched once more. And I admire countless things about Noah's love of the Marxists and his appreciation of it, but it included the reality, which I wrote about in my piece, that the whole company had been cast to look like chorus girls in the 1920s, not like chorus dancers in the 1980s, and the authenticity of that I thought was extraordinary. By the way, this is apropos of nothing, but the Spanish dancer, what's her name in
yes, Raquel Torres.
Raquel Torres. Did she ever appear in anything else? She's kind of delicious, isn't she?
She's wonderful, yeah. And there are a few other films. Yeah, I should be able to name some of them, but I find myself drawing a blank. But yes, there are a few other films, and she's remarkable.
Yes.
She was known as the Mexican Spitfire.
I thought Lupe Velez was another Mexican Spitfire.
Oh, maybe she was another Mexican Spitfire.
Several Mexican Spitfires. But it's always wonderful in the Marxists, one of the basic kind of asymmetries that governs the comedy is that there's Margaret Dumont and Thelma Todd, and the comedies are always richer for having one Margaret Dumont, as are our lives, for having a Margaret Dumont and a Thelma Todd.
And how about, we will take another question, but how about Margaret Dumont? I mean, I knew that this was going to be fun. You know you're at a great screening of a Marx Brothers movie when Margaret Dumont gets big laughs in her first scene.
And
yes?
Zeppo, too, had on a beautiful double-breasted suit.
Beautiful,
Zeppo. Yeah, that was striking. Someone else.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this excellent and spectacular presentation. I've seen Duck Soup, but not in a while, and it's even funnier than I remember it the last time I saw it. I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit about the restoration. This was a beautiful looking restoration, no scratches, no pops on the soundtrack. I also noticed that it's a Paramount picture, but I saw the Universal logo at the beginning. So just if you know anything about the restoration, how it came about, et cetera, share your thoughts or your knowledge on that with us, if you would.
Well, that's a very good question that I'm not qualified to answer in much detail. I don't know a lot about restoring old film. I know that the Blu-ray set of the Marx Brothers Paramount films, which became available about 8 years ago, is excellent. I mean, it is beautiful, and as you point out, DeRoy, the prints that we have now, and they're only available on Blu-ray, not DVD. But yes, it looks and sounds wonderful. Duck Soup has always looked and sounded pretty good, but some of the earlier films in that collection, Coconuts,
yeah.
and Coconuts, which was, I think, wrongly considered unwatchable before. It wasn't unwatchable. It's just an old movie with streaks and dust and pops. Now looks like, you know, half of it looks like it could have been filmed last week. And Animal Crackers has about 2 extra minutes restored, so it's quite valuable. That set is well worth watching, but you'd need a film expert to talk in detail smartly.
I'd say, only knowing even less than Noah does about it, that it is one of the great adventures, the wrong word, enterprises of our time, is to try and keep alive the actual physical traditions of American world movies. I was lucky enough to go to Bologna a couple of years ago, where there's one of the great restoration labs in the world, and they're constantly working, keep film going, and perhaps the greatest American director, Martin Scorsese, spends an enormous amount of his time engaged in fundraising and supervising restoration of lost films. It's so easy to look past that sheer physicality of film, and it's got to hear Marty Scorsese talk about all of the obscure noirs that were being saved from the abyss by restoration efforts.
One more?
Please.
Thank you for this. And by the way, Mr. Diamond, I saw you last night at the West Bank Cafe. Your Groucho is a real hey nani nani and a hot cha cha.
Thank you.
I remember reading that at least one member of the Marx family said that off-screen, Zeppo was the funniest. So I wondered if either of you knows some of the history of how he came to be really the straight man. I wondered, did it have anything to do with the fact that he was quite a bit younger than the others?
Well, yes, that is largely the reason. Zeppo was not just the youngest of, there are 5 brothers, of course. There's also a Gummo Marx, who was, age-wise, he was younger than Groucho and older than Zeppo, but didn't appear in any of the films, worked with them on stage. Zeppo is like almost 15 years younger than Chico, you know. He's almost another generation from the major Marx Brothers. And he was very much the kid in the act, and that is part of the reason. I think the idea of Zeppo being the funniest off stage is probably generally true. He was certainly a funny guy, and all the Marx Brothers, you know, were people with advanced senses of humor. I think maybe it's satisfying to say that he was the funniest off stage because he's so plainly the least funny on stage.
Yeah, exactly.
There was never room for Zeppo to really develop a character. But, you know, they are always better with Zeppo than without him. The 4 brothers have some impact that the 3 brothers never had. And in Duck Soup, you can kind of see, you know, he's back to a small part after doing a little better in Horse Feathers and Monkey Business.
There is. It's like the Beatles, right? John and Paul are geniuses, but the Beatles are the Beatles, and you feel that very much about the Marxes. Obviously, Groucho and Harpo, Julius and Adolf are the comic geniuses of the group. They're the ones who you can imagine working independently, and indeed, at moments they did. But it's the 4 of them that make it utterly moving. You know, just to end, Noah, you asked me when I first saw Duck Soup, and I remember it. But one of the things I find fascinating, it's a subject that we've batted back and forth between us, is we both love the Marx Brothers to distraction, and yet we both came along far too late to really understand their world and even some of their humor. I remember you were writing once that you could deliver lines like, these shine as bright as my blue serge pants, without having any idea what blue serge pants were.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that was my, when I was a teenager, and I just wanted to be Groucho, but I also wanted girls to like me. And I recall sitting on a bench outside my high school talking to some young woman I couldn't live without at the time, and actually telling her that her eyes shined like the pants of a blue serge suit. Because Groucho had said that to a woman, and so obviously that's what you say. And she didn't know what a blue serge suit was, and neither did I. And that was just the beginning of our problems.
Well, all I can say is there is something to me, not just funny and moving, but something profound about the way these 4 Jewish boys from a neighborhood in New York continue not just to give us pleasure, as many old movies and old comedians do, but somehow seem absolutely inseparable from our own imaginative lives. So, once again, the Marx Brothers.